What's going on, Rob? This is Guys, and we are back with Nightcrawlers. So this opens in one of the coolest ways ever, right? The Sons of Sinister story is phenomenal. So what we end up finding out here is that where the Nightcrawlers were originally introduced to us as what were, by all standards of measurement, kind of like the assassins of the original Mister Sinister, Nathaniel Essex, that in the first video that we did, we found that over time, the Nightcrawlers started to break away from his influence. And so what ended up happening is that defecting from Mister Sinister, they started allying themselves with Mother Righteous, who was another clone of Sinister that existed out there. Now, by and large, she had just kind of been hands-off. She was watching everything unfold. The original Quiet Council, so the original leaders of the X-Men, who were influenced by the Diamond Sinister's power, ultimately defecting, taking over from him, and then kind of launching a conquest of the universe, that one of the things that we find is that over time, while that was happening, right, that when the first video took place 10 years later, this one taking place 100 years later, that in that 90-year window, the universe has become a very dark place. The forces of magic, who have basically, again, broke away from control of Sinister, has been launching a conquest and in fact tried to bring the magical realm or the demonic realm of Limbo into the main Marvel universe and didn't succeed, right? That one of the things Xavier did as the really like the villainous version of himself, he traveled to the Shi'ar Empire, right, their home world, and used his telepathy to convince them that everybody was out to get them, and basically drove the Shi'ar Empire into a state of civil war where they all started killing each other, right? You have the forces of Asgard, which are always at war with any other race that's out there because it's trying to remain in isolation, that there's a point where Otherworld, right, so King Arthur and all those guys, that empire basically starts to crumble and fall due to no protection coming from the X-Men or anything. The universe as a whole is quite literally completely and totally falling apart. And it's really interesting to see that because the X-Men went from being heroes to being villains, that they've led to this full-scale conquest and collapse of reality as we know it in terms of any real organizational structure across the universe as a whole. It's a very dark and bleak place, but through all of that, what the Nightcrawlers have been doing in the service of Mother Righteous, if they've been kind of hopping and skipping through these different events and stealing particular artifacts, right, stealing small little things. In the midst of this giant battle between like Loki and the Asgardians and whatever force happens to be out there, the Nightcrawlers teleport in, steal an artifact, and then teleport out. And so what it does is it focuses on Asgard proper, that what they're doing is they're hunting for an artifact. Specifically, they're hunting for the hammer of Thor, and that when they get there, Thor immediately turns on them and then tries to attack them. But understand, the Nightcrawlers, at least Kurt Wagner by himself, just a guy, is probably the most prodigious assassin that Marvel Comics has, but you never see him operate in that way. But what ends up happening is that because you have Laura Kinney X-23, who was basically merged with the Nightcrawler gene, it's effectively a version of Wolverine who can teleport like Nightcrawler. She still has the adamantium claws, so she overcomes Thor like that. I mean, in the blink of an eye, slices his arm off, and that's basically it. Now, because they can't actively lift his hammer, what they end up doing is they end up having one of the other members of what are called the Nightkin, basically a different name for the Nightcrawlers, that what they do is they use their ability to manipulate gravity to control where the hammer goes. Now, that's not uncommon, and in fact, that's been a thing in Marvel Comics for years. Ever since Magneto first fought the Avengers, we've seen people who have been able to use the fundamental properties of the electromagnetic spectrum or gravity or what have you to manipulate the hammer of Thor. But what we end up doing is transitioning over to Vox Ignis, who again is basically Sean Cassidy, Banshee, with the power of kind of a Ghost Rider, basically by all standards of measurement. It has a different name and a history, but it is in effect one of the Ghost Rider spirits that ended up becoming a good guy. But the important thing here is that it is Banshee with an immense level of power, but he doesn't really do a whole lot here, so it's not overly important to understand his character. What he does do is he goes and he talks to Laura Kinney, and what she says is that her former husband basically is undergoing what's called the last rite, right? That's Summer Night, which is what he's called. She says he's losing his battle against the Diamond. Sinister is retaking control. A great trauma can have that effect. Now, here's why that matters. Because one of the things we learned is that when Sinister created the Nightcrawlers, that he intentionally bred infertility into them, meaning that they cannot procreate or they should not be able to. But much like the dinosaurs from Jurassic Park, life finds a way. And what ended up happening is Laura Kinney X-23 and the Nightcrawler Cyclops ended up having a baby. The problem is the baby suddenly teleported out, right? It literally just disappeared, seemingly out of nowhere. And what it looked like is that its powers manifested at birth and teleported away. But the kicker to this is that while Laura seemed to be able to get past it, or at the very least was kind of like, I've endured pain and torment and trauma before, that Nightcrawler Cyclops was not able to do the same and has effectively just become a drunk, right? His pain in losing his child has just gotten the worst of him. And so the result of this is he undertakes what's called the last rite, in the sense that it's ritualistic suicide. And what happens is that he literally teleports to essentially the force field that surrounds all the Moira McTaggarts in the hopes that his sacrifice will bring the force field down. Now there's something that I want you to keep in the back of your head. One, because we're kind of doing this in segments, right? So instead of doing it issue by issue in order, we're doing the Nightcrawlers, then Immortal X-Men or Immoral X-Men and so on and so forth. So based on the videos we've run, it might be a smidge out of order here, but that whole ritualistic sacrifice is something that I want you to keep in mind, because one of the things that happens is that Sean Cassidy, and having this conversation with Laura Kinney, she starts asking these questions, right? She says, we're running low on the flesh of Cortez to extend our leaps, because people who are familiar with the X-Men know Fabian Cortez is a mutant that has the ability to amplify the powers of mutants around him. And so with the inability to clone mutants the same way Sinister was, that the ability to use the abilities of Fabian Cortez are running low. So they won't be able to teleport as far as long as things stay on this current course. The other part of that is that without the ability to procreate, and with the Nightcrawlers teleporting in ritualistic suicide due to this last rite, basically the ending of their lives, their numbers are running low. In essence, the Nightcrawlers are basically going extinct. And so if for no other reason for self-preservation, you have Laura Kinney who says, you need to go ask a question to Mother Righteous in order for us to get a definitive answer. And what Sean Cassidy says, and this is something that's really important too, is he says he does talk to Mother Righteous, but she always approaches people and always asks the same question: if you could do things over, what would you have done differently? Now, one of the instances where she asked this question is to Legion. Now remember, Legion is an Omega level mutant. I mean, this guy's got thousands of personalities, each one with a power of its own, but he also has the ability to alter reality. Now within the Legion of X comic books, where the Mother Righteous was initially introduced, one of the things that Legion had done is he had basically created a pocket universe where he could bring the spiritual essence of different mutants in, and they could live a life or live some measure of escape from the reality of the world that they lived in. What he's done here is that continuing this dimensional realm, this pocket universe he created, that he literally brought the X-Men that he could save to this place. So they left their physical bodies behind, and their spiritual essence remains here, but it seems to kind of be the larger part of Legion himself. He kind of absorbed them into himself. And as he's talking to Mother Righteous, what he effectively says is, if I could do it all over again, I never would have trusted you. I never would have believed you. I never would have let you get your clutches and introduced you to the X-Men the way that I did. Such as it is, there's only one thing that I can do, and it's to simply leave to a higher plane of existence. Now, the crazy thing about this is that where X-23 is hearing this story, she initially sees the original Legion as a person that could save them, and he could. Given the level of power that he has at his disposal, he could fix everything in an instant, but he's become disillusioned with the entirety of not just the mutant population, but the universe as a whole. Why save a place that you believe simply just deserves to die, that you don't care about anymore? And so he ultimately takes off. We don't know where he goes to, and we ultimately never find out. The important thing here is that X-23 has Sean Cassidy talk to Mother Righteous for the purpose of allowing the Nightcrawlers to go on a mission. And what they end up doing is they basically teleport back to Earth, which has now just become this really dark and crappy place that's just been run amok with all the experiments of Sinister that are constantly evolving and constantly changing, albeit without any real measure of sentience of their own. And they in turn get to the Xavier Institute, right? The place where the X-Men used to reside, and they find Dr. Nemesis there. Now, Dr. Nemesis, under normal circumstances, right? James Bradley, he's just a guy that has an incredible level of intelligence, but due to the experimentation of Sinister over time, he's basically kind of been fused with what is in effect fungal matter. And what this has done is allowed him to expand this fungal matter across the entirety of the world, and has also expanded his intelligence to go along with it. So he's like this just astronomically genius being, more so than he ever was before. But the reason for the X-Men being there, or at least the Nightcrawlers being there, is because once they teleport back, the kind of situation they present to Mother Righteous is that using the intelligence of Dr. Nemesis, they can find some way to start cloning more Nightcrawlers and continue the propagation and the existence of their race. Now, something to understand here is X-23 making this declaration and presenting this entire scenario to Mother Righteous, it was effectively a ruse. She she basically went on the mission with ulterior motives. There was the public motive she gave, which is, we need to find a way so that the Nightcrawlers can continue to exist so we can continue serving you, right? You know, in an honorable fashion as our religious leader and so on and so forth. The reality here is she teleported down to Earth so she could grab the original Nightcrawler who's long since been mutated and has just kind of run its evolutionary course so that he can show up here and kill Mother Righteous. And the reason why is because what Mother Righteous does from a religious perspective, and we'll talk more about this here in a second, because I feel like the religious motivations of her character are a lot more clear in the third issue than the second issue. But when she kind of pitched herself as this religious leader, she kept talking about the spark, right? The spark of the mutant population and so on and so forth. But the reason why I say this is that the spark, as it was originally introduced in Marvel Comics, was a concept by Nightcrawler that was a colloquial term for faith, right? Keep the spark alive, keep the faith alive, right? Keep the belief alive, that kind of a thing, right? It was kind of a way to say, like, we're the ones who keep the faith strong, we're the heroes, we do the good thing, that kind of a situation. What Mother Righteous has done here is corrupt it and basically use it for her own ends. The spark is you doing whatever it is that I tell you to do because I'm your religious leader. That's basically what she's done. And so when the original Nightcrawler shows up here, he's angry at her because of the fact that she has basically perverted what the spark is supposed to represent. But Mother Righteous, in no uncertain terms, kills this guy on the spot, right? Literally wipes him out. And he's referred to as the apostate, right? The guy who defied the will of Mother Righteous, tried to kill the religious leader. And so with the death of Nightcrawler, X-23 tries to jump in, and then in turn, Mother Righteous snaps her fingers and then submits X-23 to just an astronomical amount of mental pain. But that turns out to be the nail in the coffin for Mother Righteous. And it happens in two different ways. The first is because she tells the other Nightkin to basically wrap up the apostate and then send him toward his own doom, right? To experience the last rite, which is basically teleporting him into the force field surrounding the Immoral X-Men in the hopes that they can basically break through. The other reason why this is a big deal is because in the moment when X-23 is being tortured by Mother Righteous, what happens is she gets a glimpse of the daughter that she believed to have been dead, only to find out that Mother Righteous is actually holding her prisoner. But we also get this insane moment, right? Because with issue number 3, we jump forward 1,000 years. And what we end up finding out here is somewhere along the line, and we don't know how this happened, and we're not given any explanation as to how it happened, Silver Mercator had basically merged or somehow become a combination person with the Silver Surfer. Now, the Silver Surfer, most all of you guys know who that is, but Mr. M is an Omega level mutant with the power to warp reality. So it would be like if Franklin Richards and the Silver Surfer merged, right? Just a crazy level of power. So much so that what the Silver Mercator was doing was traveling around the universe and unstitching the Lokis from reality, literally wiping them from existence, removing them from the universe. Now, this has happened in a variety of ways and among a variety of different people. Different Sinisters were overcome by the Brood Horde, which are basically the Marvel Comics version of the aliens, right? The Xenomorph movie, that kind of thing, Sigourney Weaver and all that. It's their version of that, more or less, right? The two kind of run hand in hand. But Mother Righteous herself still continues on with this idea of trying to find a way to attain what's called the Reliquary Perilous, as well as breaking through the force field of the Immoral X-Men. Now, this is where all the stuff we've been talking about starts to get cleared up. So Mother Righteous, with regards to her religious convictions, positions herself as the religious leader of the Nightcrawlers, but the reality is she doesn't care anything about them. She sees them as a means to an end. But what she'd learned over the course of her time is nothing will convince people to do something like religious faith, right? It's like that line from the Book of Eli when Gary Oldman's character is talking about the nature of the Bible, and he says it's a tool to control the weak and the desperate. And that's how Mother Righteous uses religion here, that you have all these Nightcrawlers who have these grotesque physical appearances because without the ability to clone the original Nightcrawler, they're making clones out of clones out of clones, right? So you have Laura Kinney, who is a clone of Nightcrawler, or kind of a chimera of Nightcrawler. They clone Laura Kinney, which has her own set of problems, but they clone that clone and they clone that clone, so on and so forth. So you run into this situation where you have these grotesque and mutated versions of Nightcrawler, but it doesn't matter to her because the only real purpose they serve is to basically commit ritualistic suicide. That whenever one of them show up here and they say, "Mother, I have to apologize. I've heard talk of the apostate and like the false prophet," right? So Nightcrawler, the original Nightcrawler that tried to kill Mother Righteous, and the false prophet, basically X-23, who tried to kill Mother Righteous, that whenever they hear talk about this and they tell Mother Righteous about that, in order to remove anybody that may even begin to harbor the idea that she's not telling the truth, she basically uses the religious conviction through words and saying, "It's okay, my child, take the last rite and you will be forgiven of your sins," and they teleport themselves to suicide. right? It's pretty dark, man. It's really, really dark. It's a horrible thing to do. And what's so crazy about this is, again, she doesn't believe anything she's saying. She's doing it, one part, because it gains her power, and two, just because she can, right? She's doing it for no other reason than the fact that she can. And it basically creates willful servants that are just too naive to ask any questions of her, right? By seeding out and removing any measure of dissent, that now she has this almost kind of group of people that follow her with, no pun intended, a religious fervor. And so in the midst of this conversation, or where she sends this Nightcrawler off to die, again, she has what's called a phoenix egg, which can potentially allow for the birth of a phoenix, the phoenix returning to a particular host. Again, this all kind of goes into the reliquary perilous, so you're not going to see anything crazy, which we will explain what the perilous is. But she's talked to by Dr. Nemesis, who has long since left Earth, but become this giant fungal organism. But what he's done is he's taken his ability to control fungal organisms, and now he's able to see and hear everything across the universe. And what he tells her is that the original Mister Sinister has basically resurfaced. Now, we know this just by virtue of the events that have transpired in the Immoral X-Men comic, which is really, really cool. If you guys haven't seen our video on that, you'll find a link to it down in the comments section. But what Mother Righteous says here is that she's largely been hands-off. She's been focusing on her own little scheme over here, and the Diamond X-Men and all the other X-Men out there have been waging war against each other, trying to conquer the universe and so on and so forth. And she started to realize there's a much bigger event at play here, and it all comes down to destiny. Now, that's been a common theme that we've talked about in the Sins of Sinister story. That destiny is a precognitive. She can see the future. If she tells you something's going to happen in 500 years, take it with a grain of salt. If she tells you something's going to happen in 5 minutes, take it as an absolute truth. And so she kind of touches on some of the events that have transpired over time. That Mystique ultimately ended up dying, that the entire motivation behind Destiny doing everything she did in this universe was to try to find some measure of a life with Mystique. But the reality here is that because Mystique felt like she was caged, it was only a matter of time before she went out to fight the oppressors and was ultimately killed. But with the death of Mystique, her being the wife of Destiny, the response of Destiny is, then we simply reset the timeline, and that's basically it, right? Now that my love interest is gone and there's nothing here for me anymore, now we do the right thing. We set the universe back to the way that it's supposed to be by killing one of the Mara clones. But of course, as we know from the Storm and the Brotherhood of Mutants storyline, she was killed, right? She was literally cut in half at the direction of Storm herself, right? This desire to keep this universe going, to keep this universe alive. And so what ends up happening here is Mother Righteous is told by Dr. Nemesis there is an object that is heading towards the Mora McTaggarts, right? This impenetrable force field that nobody seems to be able to access. And when Mother Righteous realizes what it is, she realizes this was set in motion by Destiny thousands of years ago, like 1,000 years ago, when the Sins of Sinister story first kicked off. And so what she does is she brings together all the Nightcrawlers. She has the trumpets sounded. They all teleport into the impenetrable force field, and they're all killed, right? They're all eradicated. And so the only other thing that she does is she basically brings in what's called Auntie Fortune. Now, Auntie Fortune was at the beginning of Sins of Sinister a Nightcrawler that had been merged with Domino. And as those of you guys who are familiar with Domino from Marvel Comics know, she has the ability to bend luck in her favor. And this is the reason why Mother Righteous always has the brain of Auntie Fortune around her, because no matter what happens, things will always happen to fall in her favor. Luck will always be on her side. And her being here is no different, because what happens is that in watching all of this transpire, you suddenly have a Ghost Rider imbued Galactus who arrives on the scene. And it's amazing to see, because when that happens, right, Banshee shows up and says like, yes, somewhere along the line, we don't know how it happened, and honestly, we never find out how it happened. All the different spirits of vengeance that had escaped Earth at the rise of the forces of Sinister bonded themselves to Galactus. Now, all of this seems to be predicated on the fact that Galactus, being a being of hunger, was hunger for vengeance against the mutant population for everything they had done to the universe. But whatever the motivation is, it's a being traveling around the universe with the powers of the Ghost Rider, wiping out everything in his path. And so where you do have Sean Cassidy that says, we have to step in and do something, the response of Mother Righteous is no. She says, 1,000 years ago, the Sinisters shot an unstoppable object right through the brain of a Titan. They didn't stop to wonder where it would go next, but Destiny did. Destiny knew. Now, if you guys remember, at the very beginnings of the Sins of Sinister story, the first one shot that we got, that you had the island of Krakoa that literally had a giant tree free that the mutant population could talk to. What ended up happening is that in an effort to lobotomize the Krakoan island and take away its control, allowing the X-Men free reign to operate as they wanted to under the influence of Sinister, they shot the Juggernaut through its head. And what she says is a millennium of gravity wells, slingshots, infinitesimal changes, of course, building speed, becoming light in time, screaming in the silence of the vacuum, unable to die, unable to stop, madder than a box of otters, while she tweaked the path of the world farm, setting up a cosmic trick shot, an impossible conjunction, enter the Juggernaut. And the Juggernaut smashes through the head of Galactus, like bam! Now, this is the cool thing about this. Destiny set all this in motion. She set everything in motion. And this is why I say, this is why Destiny is such a cool character, because 1,000 years ago, Destiny looked at what was gonna happen in the future and said, okay, the X-Men are most likely gonna do this is most likely what's gonna happen, that's most likely what's gonna happen. So in order to ensure everything transpires the way it's supposed to, I will do this, and move these pieces around in this way, so that at the right time, the Juggernaut, as he was shot into space by the X-Men, would ultimately smash through the head of Galactus, and in doing so, puncture a hole through the impenetrable force field of the Moira McTaggarts, right? The right place at the right time. That's how capable of a precognitive Destiny is. And so the result of this is that with the Moira McTaggart force field basically being blown wide open, it allows Mother Righteous to enter with the Reliquary Perilous. Now, here's the funny thing about the Reliquary Perilous, that the way she pitched it to the Nightcrawlers, the way she built it to the Nightcrawlers, it's an artifact of unimaginable power. It's the thing in which we worship, and it's a thing that we value. That's never what it was. She was using it as a tool against the Nightcrawlers in order to gain their faithful service. The nature of the Reliquary Perilous is that it's a time capsule, that when she went around and she was asking all these people, if you could change anything, what would you change? She would take their answers and she would confine it in the Reliquary Perilous. She knows it's only a matter of time before somebody resets the entirety of the universe by killing one of the Moiras. Remember, the power of Moira McTaggart is every time she dies, the universe resets. Now, the goal of Mother Righteous was to grab all these different artifacts, all these different bits of power, how these different things work, where to gain these little pieces of power, right? To even take things like the Phoenix Egg and so on, confine it into what's basically a time capsule and send it back through the time stream, and then kill one of the Moiras herself and reset reality, so that when the time came, because Mother Righteous is a clone of Sinister, and because she was around 200 years before the events of Sins of Sinister ever took place, that what she would be able to do is she could send the artifact to herself, and then she would gain an astronomical amount of power, and she'd be able to basically conquer existence. She could make the universe whatever she wanted it to be, using the power of the Phoenix Egg, so on and so forth, making herself a host for the Phoenix Force with the power of Thor, all that kind of cool stuff. But of course, what ends up happening here is that with Banshee realizing the goal of Mother Righteous was never to try to find a way to preserve the entirety of this universe, but to actually kidnap the child of X-23 so it can be used for, really even raised for Mother Righteous' own ends in the distant past, to basically send all that back and effectively wipe out the universe. That Banshee has the same motivation that Storm did in Storm of the Brotherhood, where she basically made this argument in saying that yes, this universe is awful, but those who are native to this universe, who were born into this universe, they all have the right to try to find the best possible life they can, and that by wiping this universe out, we're taking that away from them. We're dooming countless billions or trillions of people. And so in that moment, he tries to attack Mother Righteous. Now, when that happens, she strips him of his power. And with him basically being powerless, that's when X-23 jumps in with the intention of attacking Mother Righteous. Now, she is able to hit her momentarily, but of course, using her own power, Mother Righteous is able to overcome X-23. But in that moment, Sean Cassidy, looking to atone for all of his actions over the course of Sins of Sinister, ends up stabbing Mother Righteous as a distraction, and once that distraction comes in, X-23 stabs Mother Righteous through the chest with her tail and kills her on the spot. And so when it's all said and done, basically Laura gets her daughter and then teleports away, right? She gets her child and just takes off, and that's basically it. Banshee's just kind of left there dying, and to kind of atone for his actions, the Reliquary Perilous is just sitting there on the ground, and ultimately what ends up happening is the true Moira McTaggart arrives and seizes it for herself. All indications being she's gonna do exactly what Mother Righteous did, which is find a way to send the heart back to herself, kill herself, reset the timeline, and then attain absolute power. Because lest we forget, one of the things we learn in Jonathan Hickman's run on the X-Men in Inferno is that in order to save the mutant population, the goal of Moira McTaggart was to eliminate all the mutant powers and the mutant gene itself while preserving the lives of anybody who was a mutant, in effect, making every mutant human. Whether that works or not, we don't fully know. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.